The cold November rain hammered against the windows of Coldwater Creek Mill as the night shift bell rang at 8 o'clock. The sound echoed through the cobblestone streets of Lawrence, Massachusetts, mixing with the distant rumble of the Merrimack River that churned brown and violent below the dam. Inside the 5-story brick building that loomed over the working-class tenements like a cathedral of industry, 200 souls prepared for another 12-hour descent into hell. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the unpaved streets into rivers of mud and refuse. The workers trudged through it in shoes with holes, coats that provided little warmth. Their bodies already exhausted from the day shift, many of them had worked at other factories. Lawrence was a city built on textile mills, and its working class moved between them like ghosts, never resting, never escaping, caught in an economic trap that ground them down until they were too broken to work, at which point they were simply replaced. Samuel Thorne stood in his office on the top floor, watching the workers file in through the iron gates below. His reflection in the rain-streaked glass showed a man of 42 years, well-fed and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than most of his employees earned in a year. The suit had been tailored in Boston by craftsmen who would have been horrified to know that their work adorned a man who chained human beings to machines. His factory produced the finest cotton fabric in New England, fabric that would become dresses for wealthy women in Boston and New York, curtains for mansions in Providence, bed linens for hotels that his workers would never be able to afford to stay in. His methods, though whispered about in working-class taverns and church basements, had made him one of the wealthiest men in the Commonwealth. He owned 3 houses, one in Lawrence near the mill, one in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood, and a summer estate in Newport, Rhode Island. He was a member of the Massachusetts Club, dined regularly with state senators and congressmen, and his wife hosted charity events that raised money for the poor, money that never seemed to reach the workers who actually created his wealth. The innovation that built his fortune was simple, brutal, and kept carefully hidden from the Massachusetts Board of Labor Statistics. During night shifts, when inspectors were home with their families and newspapers went to print, when the world outside the mill walls slept in ignorant comfort, Samuel Thorne chained his workers to their looms. The idea had come to him during a business trip to a southern plantation in 1879. 2 decades after the Civil War had supposedly ended the practice of forced labor in America. He had noticed how the overseers kept field workers in controlled positions, how productivity increased when workers understood they could not simply walk away. Of course, the plantation owner had been more circumspect about the methods employed, speaking in euphemisms about contract enforcement and labor retention strategies. But Samuel Thorne was a practical man who understood the underlying principle: people work harder when they have no choice. He had started small, testing the system with a single row of looms, telling the workers it was a new safety measure to prevent them from wandering into dangerous machinery in the dim light. The chains were light at first, almost symbolic, but the productivity increase was immediate and undeniable. Workers who knew they couldn't leave their stations, didn't take breaks, didn't slow down, didn't waste time in conversation with other workers. They simply worked, hour after hour, because there was literally nothing else they could do, over 18 months. Samuel Thorne had refined the system with the same methodical care he applied to machinery maintenance. The chains had to be heavy enough to prevent escape, but not so heavy that they tired workers before the shift began. The ankle cuffs had to be tight enough to prevent slipping, but not so tight that they immediately cut off circulation. As he had learned during early trials, when 3 workers had lost feet to gangrene, the length of chain had been calculated precisely at 4 feet, allowing workers to reach all parts of their loom, but not to sit, not to reach the emergency stop lever that could shut down their machine, not to help a worker at the next station who might collapse or become injured. Margaret O'Connor arrived at the mill entrance with her daughter, 14-year-old Catherine. The girl's hands were already calloused and scarred from 2 years working the machines. Her fingers twisted slightly from the repetitive motions, her back permanently curved from standing in the same position for 12 hours at a time. Margaret had tried to keep her daughter in school, had pleaded with the priests at St. Mary's, had even gone to the Labour office downtown, where a bored clerk told her that child labour was legal as long as the child was over 12 and the parent consented. She had never consented, not really. Consent implied choice, and there was no choice when your husband Patrick had died in a loom accident 3 months prior, crushed when a support beam gave way during routine maintenance that Samuel Thorne had delayed for 6 months to save money. The beam had been marked as dangerous by the previous shift foreman, who had been fired for raising concerns. Patrick had been 41 years old, father of 3 daughters, the youngest only 6, a man who had worked every day of his life since he was 8 years old and had nothing to show for it but a rented room in a tenement building where 7 families shared one toilet. The company had paid nothing for Patrick's death. There was no compensation fund, no life insurance, no pension for widows. The company doctor had ruled it an accident caused by Patrick's own negligence, claiming he should have noticed the cracked beam, ignoring the fact that Patrick had reported it to management twice and been told to stop complaining and keep working. Margaret had tried to sue, had consulted with a lawyer who worked out of a cramped office above a saloon, but the lawyer explained that Massachusetts law was very clear. Employers bore no legal responsibility for workplace accidents unless deliberate malice could be proven, and good luck proving that against a man who could afford the best legal representation in the state. So Margaret worked, and Catherine worked, and their 2 younger daughters stayed home and cared for the baby and tried to learn to read from newspapers they found in the street. And somehow they survived, day after day, week after week, living in a state of perpetual exhaustion that made even thinking about the future feel like a luxury they couldn't afford. Margaret was 36 years old, but looked 50. Her hair grey, her face lined with worry and pain, her body worn down by decades of poverty and labour. She had stopped dreaming years ago, had accepted that life was simply about survival, about making it through one more day, and then another and another, until eventually you couldn't anymore, and then you died, and someone else took your place at the loom. The mill floor was a cathedral of industry, 150 looms arranged in precise rows, each one an iron monster standing 8 feet tall and 12 feet wide, weighing nearly a ton, capable of crushing a human body if it fell. The air was thick with cotton dust that coated the lungs and made every breath a labor, that settled on every surface like snow, that turned workers' hair white regardless of their age. The temperature was kept at exactly 85 degrees Fahrenheit, with artificial humidity, because Samuel Thorne had calculated that moist heat kept the cotton threads from breaking, increased productivity by 9%. That it also made workers faint and collapse was merely the cost of efficiency, a statistic to be managed rather than a problem to be solved. On average, 3 workers collapse per night shift from heat exhaustion. They would wake up still chained to their looms, and the overseer would throw cold water on them and tell them to get back to work. If they couldn't stand, they would be unchained, carried to the street, and docked a full shift's pay. Another worker would be brought from the pool of desperate unemployed that always waited outside the mill gates, people so desperate for work that they would accept any conditions, any treatment, any degradation. The noise was the worst part, worse even than the chains or the heat. 150 looms operating simultaneously created a sound that exceeded 105 decibels, louder than standing next to a train, loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage within months. Every worker at Coldwater Creek Mill suffered hearing loss, some going completely deaf by age 30. The sound wasn't just loud, it was physically painful, a constant assault that made the skull vibrate, that made teeth ache, that created a pressure behind the eyes, that built and built until workers felt like their heads would explode. Communication was impossible through the noise. Workers communicated through hand signals and lip reading, through a complex system of gestures that had evolved over years. But even that was limited because the cotton dust made seeing difficult, created a white fog that reduced visibility to a few feet. Workers lived in a world of sound and fury, unable to see clearly, unable to hear anything except the mechanical roar, unable to think beyond the immediate task of keeping the shuttle moving, keeping the thread feeding, keeping the loom operating, because to stop meant punishment. The punishment for slowing production was systematic and creative. First offense meant a 10% pay reduction for the week. Second offense meant being moved to the worst position in the mill, directly under the steam pipes, where the temperature exceeded 100 degrees. Third offense meant being assigned to the cleaning crew, a job that required crawling under operating looms to clear jammed cotton, a job where workers regularly lost fingers or entire hands to the machinery, where death was common enough that the company kept spare workers on standby, specifically to replace cleaning crew casualties. As the night shift workers took their positions, the overseers moved through the rows with their chains and padlocks. The system was methodical. Each worker's left ankle was fitted with an iron cuff, attached to a 4-foot chain bolted to the floor beneath their loom. They could move enough to operate the machine, to reach for new spools of thread, to clear jams in the mechanism. They could not leave. They could not run if a fire started. They could not even sit down. Catherine felt the cold metal close around her ankle and heard the lock click shut. She glanced at her mother 3 looms away, saw the same resignation in her eyes. The overseer, a man named Dutch, who had worked his way up from the floor by informing on fellow workers, pulled the chain taut to test it, then moved on without a word. The machines started with a deafening roar. 150 looms operating simultaneously created a sound that made thought impossible, that drove itself into the skull like nails. Workers communicated through hand signals and lip reading. The cotton dust grew thicker as the looms threw off fibers, creating a white fog that burned the eyes and throat. Samuel Thorne descended to the floor at midnight for his customary inspection. He walked through the rows of chained workers with a ledger, noting the output of each loom, marking down the numbers that would become his wealth. He paused at Catherine's station, watching the girl's hands fly across the shuttle despite the exhaustion in her young face. The mathematics were beautiful to him. With workers chained in place, bathroom breaks were eliminated. Productivity increased by 17%. Minor injuries no longer resulted in workers leaving their posts. The night shift, once his least profitable due to slower output and more frequent breaks, now outperformed the day shift by 12%. The chains, purchased in bulk from a prison supply company in Rhode Island, had cost him $600. They had generated an additional $43,000 in profit over the past 18 months. What Samuel Thorne did not record in his ledgers were the other costs. The number of workers who collapsed at their looms from exhaustion and overheating, waking to find themselves still chained, still expected to work. The infections that developed in the ankle cuffs, turning routine restraint into gangrenous torture. The woman on the 3rd floor, who had miscarried during a shift and continued working for 3 hours while chained before an overseer, noticed the blood pooling at her feet. And he did not record Thomas Brennan. Thomas was a young man of 19, broad-shouldered and strong, who had worked at Coldwater Creek Mill for 2 years. He had been a dock worker before coming to the mill, was used to hard labor under difficult conditions, had worked in snow and rain and brutal summer heat, unloading cargo ships from Liverpool and Boston. But nothing had prepared him for the psychological torture of being chained like an animal night after night, for the slow, systematic destruction of his sense of self, for the gradual erosion of his humanity under the relentless machine roar and the weight of the iron cuff around his ankle. Thomas had a theory, something he thought about during the long nights at the loom when thought was the only escape available. He believed that human dignity wasn't something abstract or philosophical, but something concrete and physical, something that could be measured by how much control a person had over their own body, over their own movements. Free people could walk away from situations, could say no, could make choices about where to be and when. Slaves, whether legal or economic, could not. The chain around his ankle wasn't just metal, it was a physical manifestation of his powerlessness. A constant reminder that his body didn't belong to him, but to Samuel Thorne, to the mill, to the economic system that had turned human beings into components of industrial production. He could feel it every second, even when he wasn't moving. The weight of it, the restriction of it, the knowledge that he was bound, that he was property, that he had less freedom than his grandfather's horse had possessed. He had watched his spirit break gradually over the 2 years, had felt his sense of self erode with each shift until he barely recognized the hollow creature who stared back from mirrors. He had stopped talking to friends, stopped attending the social events at the Irish Community Centre, stopped going to church because he couldn't stand the sermons about God's love, when God seemed perfectly content to let Samuel Thorne chain people to machines. He had stopped feeling much of anything except a dull ache that persisted even when he was away from the mill, a psychological wound that never healed because the source of it never went away. His mother had noticed the change, had tried to talk to him about it, but what could he say? That he was dying inside while still breathing, that the chain was killing something essential in him that had nothing to do with his physical body. She wouldn't understand. She came from a generation that had survived the potato famine, that had watched children starve, that measured survival by whether you were still alive at the end of the day. Thomas's suffering was too abstract for her, too internal, too much about feelings and dignity and other luxuries that poor people couldn't afford. On this particular November night, as rain continued to pound the roof and lightning occasionally illuminated the windows high above, Thomas made a decision. He would be free, whatever the cost. The opportunity came at 2 a.m. when Dutch made his rounds. The overseer walked behind each row of looms, checking chains and noting any mechanical problems. As he passed Thomas's station, the young man spoke for the first time in 3 months, his voice barely audible over the machine roar. Dutch leaned in to hear, bringing his face close to Thomas's. He never saw the shuttle coming. Thomas had been palm spinning it for an hour, building up momentum. The wooden implement, hardened by years of use and weighing nearly 3 pounds, caught Dutch across the temple with enough force to crack bone. The overseer went down hard. Thomas had perhaps 90 seconds before the collapse was noticed. He dragged Dutch's body behind the loom, fumbled through the man's pockets until he found the ring of keys. His hands shook as he tried each one on his ankle cuff. The 4th key turned. The chain fell away. The sensation of freedom was so overwhelming that Thomas nearly collapsed. After months of that constant weight, that perpetual reminder of captivity, the absence of the chain felt like weightlessness. He looked up and down the row of looms. Every face was turned toward him, every pair of eyes watching to see what he would do. Thomas ran. He ran past the rows of chained workers, past the shocked faces of other overseers, toward the main staircase that led to the ground floor. He made it down 3 floors before Samuel Thorne's office door opened and the mill owner himself stepped into the stairwell. They faced each other in the narrow space, worker and master, the exploited and the exploiter. Samuel Thorne's expression showed no anger, only a cold calculation. He reached into his coat and produced a small revolver. The gunshot echoed through the stairwell, but Thomas had already moved, had thrown himself down the final flight of stairs in a desperate tumble. The bullet struck the wall where his head had been. Thomas crashed through the ground floor door and out into the rain-soaked night, running through streets he barely recognized in his panic, running until his lungs burned and his legs gave out in an alley 3 blocks from the mill. He lay in the mud and rain, gasping, and realized that Dutch's keys were still clutched in his hand. The keys represented more than just physical escape. They represented the possibility of resistance, the proof that the system wasn't invincible, that chains could be broken even by ordinary people with nothing but desperation and courage. Thomas spent that night in the alley, too terrified to move, too exhausted to care if he lived or died. The rain had soaked through his clothes, and he was shivering violently, his body going into shock from the cold and the adrenaline crash. He kept seeing Dutch's face inches from his own, kept feeling the impact of the shuttle against the man's skull, kept hearing the sound it made, a wet crack that suggested something had broken inside Dutch's head. Was Dutch dead? Thomas had no way of knowing. He hadn't stayed to check, had just grabbed the keys and run. If Dutch was dead, that made Thomas a murderer. If Dutch lived, that made Thomas an attempted murderer. Either way, the law would see him hanged. Self-defense didn't apply to workers who attacked overseers, didn't apply when the victim was enforcing property rights that the courts had repeatedly upheld as legal and proper. But as dawn broke and the rain finally stopped, as he heard the church bells ring 6 o'clock and felt the weak November sun on his face, something hardened inside him. He had escaped once. He could help others escape. He had the keys. But more importantly, he had broken through the psychological barrier that kept most workers passive and compliant. He had discovered that Samuel Thorne was not invincible, that the overseers were not untouchable, that the system could be resisted. The terror of being chained was not just physical. It was the learned helplessness that came from being utterly powerless, day after day, night after night, until you internalized that powerlessness, until you began to believe that resistance was impossible, that the chains were permanent, that this was simply how the world worked and always would work. Breaking that psychological chain was harder than breaking the physical one, required a level of desperation or courage or madness that most people never reached. Thomas had reached it, and now that he had, he couldn't go back to accepting chains, couldn't unsee what he had seen, couldn't unknow what he now knew about the nature of power and resistance. Inside the mill, Samuel Thorne descended to the floor and addressed the chained workers. His voice was calm, almost gentle, amplified by the brief silence as he had ordered the machines shut down. He explained that Thomas Brennan was a thief and a murderer who had stolen company property, namely the keys, and assaulted an overseer. He explained that the police had been notified and Thomas would surely hang. He explained that this incident demonstrated why the chains were necessary, that workers could not be trusted, that order must be maintained. Then he ordered the machines restarted and returned to his office to update his ledgers. Dutch, alive but concussed, was taken to a company doctor. The night shift continued for another 6 hours. Thomas Brennan spent that night in the alley, too terrified to move, too exhausted to care if he lived or died. But as dawn broke and the rain finally stopped, as he heard the church bells ring 6 o'clock and felt the weak November sun on his face, something hardened inside him. He had escaped once. He could help others escape. He had the keys. The days that followed became a careful dance of survival and planning. Thomas hid during daylight hours, moving between abandoned buildings in Lawrence's poorest districts, places where the police rarely ventured and where residents knew better than to ask questions about strangers. He slept in coal cellars and empty warehouses, ate from garbage bins behind restaurants, drank water from rain barrels. He was constantly cold, constantly hungry, constantly terrified of being discovered. but he was free. For the first time in 2 years, his ankle bore no weight except his own body. He could walk where he wanted, stop when he wanted, move at his own pace. The simple act of taking a step without feeling the tug of a chain was intoxicating. He would catch himself crying sometimes, overwhelmed by sensations he had forgotten were possible, by the realization of how much had been taken from him and was now being slowly returned. At night, he observed the mill from across the street, noting the patterns of guard changes, the movements of workers arriving and leaving, the times when the building was least watched. He began to understand the mill as a system, to see its vulnerabilities, to identify the moments when resistance might be possible. Samuel Thorne had made the mill into a fortress against workers escaping, but he had not prepared it against someone trying to break in, against an attack from within. He began making contact with other workers, approaching them in the pre-dawn hours as they left the day shift, showing them Dutch's keys, speaking in urgent whispers about freedom and resistance. Most were too frightened, too broken to listen. The mill was all they knew. The chains had become almost normal. But a few listened. Margaret O'Connor listened. She met Thomas in the basement of St. Mary's Church 2 weeks after his escape. Father Brennan, no relation to Thomas but sympathetic to the workers' plight, had arranged the meeting. Margaret brought 3 other women who worked the night shift, all of them desperate, all of them terrified of what might happen to their families if they were caught conspiring. Thomas laid out his plan. It was simple and would require courage. On a specific night, he would enter the mill during the shift change, that brief window when the day workers were leaving and the night workers arriving, when confusion provided cover. He would make his way to the floor and begin unlocking chains. The freed workers would then unlock others. Once enough were free, they would barricade the doors, hold the mill until newspapers and labor organizers could arrive, until the whole state could see what Samuel Thorne had been doing to his workers. Margaret listened to this plan and saw 100 ways it could fail. Could end with all of them dead or imprisoned, but she also saw her daughter's face, saw the light dying in Catherine's eyes night after night. She agreed to help. The date was set for December 7th, 3 days before the Massachusetts Board of Labor Statistics was scheduled to make their annual inspection. Samuel Thorne always ran regular operations during inspections, no chains, reasonable hours, even provided lunch. For 1 week each year, the mill operated as though it were a normal, lawful enterprise. Thomas calculated that the proximity to the inspection would make the contrast more shocking, would make it harder for authorities to dismiss worker complaints as lies. In the days leading up to the 7th, Thomas recruited 12 workers willing to take the risk. They met in cellars and abandoned warehouses, coordinated through whispered messages and hand signals on the mill floor. Margaret became the coordinator, using her position as a long-time employee to move between stations, to identify which overseers would be where at what times. Samuel Thorne noticed nothing. His ledgers showed strong profits. Production was up 14% over the previous quarter, and he was already planning an expansion that would add another floor to the mill. He was considering implementing the chain system on the day shift as well. Had been corresponding with other mill owners about adopting the practice industry-wide. In his mind, he was an innovator, a man who had solved the labor problem through simple mechanical means. December 7th arrived with heavy snow, unusual for so early in the season. The morning shift ended at 6 o'clock as always, workers filing out through the gates while the night shift assembled in the courtyard. In the confusion of 200 people moving in opposite directions through narrow doors, Thomas slipped inside. He wore a worker's coat and cap that Margaret had provided, kept his head down, moved with the crowd. He made it to the main floor and took a position near the back, in the section where new workers were typically assigned. The overseers were busy with the chaining process, working their way through the rows. Thomas waited, counting seconds, hand on the key ring in his pocket. The machines started up with their usual roar. Thomas counted to 100, then moved to the woman chained next to him. Her name was Elizabeth, 53 years old, grandmother of 6. He showed her the key, put a finger to his lips for silence, and unlocked her ankle cuff. Her eyes went wide with shock, then understanding. She nodded toward the next worker in line. It took Thomas 4 minutes to free 11 workers, moving down the row while the overseers were clustered at the far end of the floor. The freed workers immediately began moving to other rows, unlocking more chains with the duplicate keys Thomas had managed to have made at a locksmith in Boston. Within 15 minutes, 47 workers were free, and still no alarm had been raised. The plan was working better than Thomas had dared hope, but he had not accounted for Samuel Thorne's new security measures. The mill owner had, in fact, noticed increased whispers among workers, had seen the small meetings that broke up too quickly when overseers approached. He was not a stupid man, merely an evil one. He had installed a new monitoring system, a series of bell wires connected to each row of looms. If more than 3 chains in any section were unlocked simultaneously, a bell would ring in his office. The bell rang at 6:23 p.m. Samuel Thorne moved quickly, pulling the lever that locked all the building's exits, a new feature he had installed after Thomas's escape. Heavy iron bars dropped into place across every door on all 5 floors. He then activated the mill's whistle, a prearranged signal that brought armed guards running from the gatehouse. Thomas heard the doors slam shut and knew immediately what it meant. They were trapped. Worse, they had only freed half the workers. The other half were still chained to their looms, unable to run even if escape had been possible. The guards entered the floor with rifles raised. 6 men in the private security company uniforms that Samuel Thorne employed. They formed a line at the main entrance, blocking any exit. Samuel Thorne himself appeared moments later, still impeccably dressed despite the late hour, his revolver drawn. The freed workers clustered together in the center of the floor, while the chained workers watched from their looms, their faces showing terror and hopelessness in equal measure. The machines continued to run, their roar making communication nearly impossible. Samuel Thorne had to shout to be heard. He offered them a choice: return to your chains willingly and face only standard discipline, loss of 2 weeks' wages and assignment to the worst stations for 3 months. Refuse, and he would have each of them arrested for theft, trespassing, destruction of property, and conspiracy. In Massachusetts in 1881, such charges could mean years in state prison. Thomas stepped forward, Dutch's original keyring held high. He shouted back, his voice raw but carrying above the machine noise. He told Samuel Thorne that there were reporters waiting outside the gates, that Father Brennan had contacted the Boston Globe and the Springfield Republican, that by morning all of Massachusetts would know about the chains. It was a lie. Thomas had no such connections. But Samuel Thorne did not know that. The mill owner's face showed the first crack in his composure, a flicker of uncertainty. His fortune, his reputation, his social standing among Boston's elite, all of it depended on these practices remaining hidden. If newspapers published stories about chained workers, the Massachusetts Board of Labor Statistics would be forced to act. Politicians would demand reform. Other mill owners would distance themselves from him to protect their own interests. He lowered his revolver and spoke more quietly, though his voice still carried through the floor. He proposed a negotiation. The workers would return to their stations. He would remove the chains immediately and permanently, and both sides would agree to never speak of this incident. No charges, no arrests, no reporters. The night shift would become voluntary, with a 10% wage increase for those who chose to work it. It was Margaret who responded, stepping forward to stand beside Thomas. She was shaking, but her voice was steady. She told Samuel Thorne that his offer meant nothing, that they had only his word, that he had proven himself a liar and a tyrant. She demanded that he unlock all the doors, allow the chained workers to be freed, and agree to allow a labor organizer to inspect the mill weekly. The standoff lasted 17 minutes, during which the looms continued to operate and the chained workers watched helplessly, during which Samuel Thorne calculated risks and profits and the cost of his reputation, during which Thomas Brennan felt the weight of 100 lives balanced on what he said next. The decision was made by Catherine O'Connor, the 14-year-old girl still chained to her loom, still operating the machine because to stop would mean punishment, made eye contact with her mother across the floor. Then she did something that would be remembered in labor history for generations. She reached into the running loom and deliberately jammed her hand into the mechanism. The scream cut through even the machine roar. The loom seized up, shredding her fingers, the blood spraying across the white cotton. Margaret broke away from the group and ran to her daughter, screaming, pulling at the chain that held Catherine in place. Other chained workers began doing the same, deliberately sabotaging their looms, jamming the mechanisms, breaking the shuttles, destroying months of production in minutes. Samuel Thorne watched his fortune self-destruct before his eyes. The cost of repairing the looms would be enormous. The loss of production would be catastrophic. And with Catherine's injuries, with dozens of witnesses to a child being mutilated while chained, no amount of money or influence could keep this quiet. He ordered the doors unlocked. He ordered all the chains removed. Then he turned and walked back to his office, knowing that by morning his world would be over. The workers flooded out into the December snow, carrying Catherine between them, racing toward the hospital. Father Brennan was indeed waiting outside, not with reporters, but with a doctor he had brought in case of violence. As they tended to Catherine's mangled hand, as Margaret wept and Thomas stood in the snow, feeling simultaneously triumphant and hollow, the workers began to tell their stories to anyone who would listen. By dawn, crowds had gathered outside Coldwater Creek Mill. By noon, the Boston Globe had a reporter on site. By evening, the Massachusetts Board of Labor Statistics had initiated an emergency investigation. By the end of the week, Samuel Thorne was facing 17 counts of criminal endangerment, 43 counts of unlawful restraint, and civil suits from more than 100 workers. But the real reckoning came not from courts or newspapers, but from the workers themselves. On December 14th, every employee of Coldwater Creek Mill refused to enter the building. They stood outside in the freezing cold and declared a strike. It was one of the first coordinated labor actions in Massachusetts history, and it spread like wildfire. Within 3 weeks, 12 other mills in Lawrence had experienced similar strikes. Within 2 months, the Massachusetts state legislature had passed the first comprehensive worker protection laws in the United States. Samuel Thorne's mill closed permanently in March of 1882. He sold the building to settle legal debts and died 5 years later in reduced circumstances, though still wealthy by any normal measure. His name became synonymous with labor exploitation, a cautionary tale used by reformers and organizers for decades. Thomas Brennan became a prominent labor organizer, traveling throughout New England to speak about the Coldwater Creek incident. He never stopped carrying Dutch's keys, showed them at every speech as a symbol of what workers had overcome. Margaret O'Connor and her daughter Catherine survived. The girl lost 3 fingers, but kept her hand. They moved to Boston, where Margaret found work in a garment factory that had unionized after hearing about the Coldwater Creek strike. Catherine learned to operate a sewing machine despite her injury and eventually became a foreman, famous for never allowing any worker under her supervision to be treated as less than human. The chains themselves were collected after the mill closed and melted down. The metal was used to cast a small monument that still stands in Lawrence's Central Park. It shows a broken shackle and bears a simple inscription: "Freedom is not given, it is taken, December 1881. But the psychological scars remained. Thomas Brennan never fully recovered from his months in captivity. would wake screaming from nightmares of being chained, of the machine roar, of Dutch's face leaning in close. Catherine O'Connor lived with chronic pain and phantom sensations in her missing fingers. Every worker who had been chained carried trauma that no court settlement or labor law could fully address. The horror of Coldwater Creek Mill was not supernatural. There were no ghosts haunting the looms, no demons possessing Samuel Thorne, no mystical curses or otherworldly intervention. The horror was entirely human. The monster was capitalism unchecked by morality or law. The evil was the simple mathematical calculation that human suffering was acceptable if it increased profit margins. That is the terror that should keep people awake at night. Not supernatural threats or impossible scenarios, but the very real knowledge that human beings are capable of chaining other human beings to machines and calling it business. That there are always people willing to exploit, to dehumanize, to torture for profit, and that the only thing standing between such exploitation and its victims is the willingness of ordinary people to say no, to resist, to break their chains and help others break theirs. The mill building still stands in Lawrence, converted now to luxury condominiums, because in America, even the sites of great suffering eventually become commodities. Tourists walk past the Central Park monument without reading the inscription. History textbooks mention the Coldwater Creek incident in a single paragraph, if at all. The chains are forgotten. But in the immigrant neighborhoods of Lawrence, in the working-class communities throughout Massachusetts, in union halls and labor organizing meetings, the story is still told. Parents tell children about Margaret and Thomas and Catherine, about the night the workers broke their chains. They tell it as a reminder that freedom is fragile, that it must be fought for constantly, that the moment people stop resisting exploitation is the moment new chains start being forged. And they tell it as a warning, because while the literal chains of Coldwater Creek Mill are gone, the impulse that created them, the willingness of some people to treat others as mere resources to be exploited, that has never disappeared. It simply evolves, adapts, finds new forms. The chains today might be debt instead of iron, might be surveillance instead of padlocks, might be algorithmic control instead of overseers with keys. But the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Those with power seeking to extract maximum value from those without power, and those without power having to decide whether to accept their chains or break them. The real horror story is not what happened at Coldwater Creek Mill in 1881. The real horror story is how little has fundamentally changed in the relationship between labor and capital, between the exploited and the exploiters, between those who create wealth and those who extract it. The mechanisms have grown more sophisticated, the chains less visible, but the essential dynamic persists. Thomas Brennan understood this in his final years. He gave his last speech in 1923, at age 61, to a crowd of garment workers in Boston who were fighting for better conditions. His hands shook as he held up Dutch's keys, the metal worn smooth by decades of handling. He told them that breaking the chains at Coldwater Creek Mill had been necessary, but not sufficient. He told them that every generation had to break its own chains, had to recognize its own form of bondage and resist it. He told them that freedom was not a state that could be achieved once and then maintained passively. Freedom was an active process, a constant struggle, a decision that had to be remade every single day. The moment people stopped fighting for their freedom, the moment they accepted their chains as normal or inevitable or just the way things were, that was the moment they lost. He died 3 months after that speech, never knowing that his words would be proven prescient by the Great Depression, by the labor struggles of the 1930s, by the continued cycles of exploitation and resistance that would mark the 20th century and beyond. The Coldwater Creek Mill incident became a footnote in history books, a minor episode in the larger story of American industrialization. But for those who were there, for those who felt the weight of the chains and the terror of being trapped, for those who understood that they had faced a choice between submission and resistance, and had chosen resistance despite overwhelming odds, it was the defining moment of their lives. Catherine O'Connor lived until 1954. In her final years, she gave interviews to labor historians who were documenting the early union movement. She would hold up her scarred hand and explain what she had done that night in December 1881. How she had deliberately destroyed her own fingers to force the situation to a crisis point. The historians asked her if she regretted it. She told them no. She told them that some choices are worth any price. She told them that her fingers were a small sacrifice compared to what others had endured, and that if her action had helped break the system even slightly, had helped move toward a world where workers were treated as human beings instead of machinery, then it had been necessary. The psychological terror of the Coldwater Creek Mill story lies not in jump scares or supernatural threats, but in the slow, grinding horror of realizing that your life is considered worthless by those who control it. That you can be chained like an animal and it's legal. That you can be worked to death and it's just business. That your children can be mutilated in machines and it's regrettable but acceptable. The terror is in understanding that this was not the work of monsters or aberrations, but of ordinary people operating within a system that valued profit over human life. Samuel Thorne was not insane. He was not possessed. He was not unusually cruel by the standards of his time and class. He simply applied logic and mathematics to human suffering, calculated that the benefit to himself outweighed the cost to others, and acted accordingly. That is more frightening than any ghost story. The chains of Coldwater Creek Mill were real, their weight measurable in pounds of iron, their constraint quantifiable in feet of movement allowed, but they were also metaphorical, representing all the ways that people are bound to systems that exploit them. All the ways that freedom is restricted by those who benefit from restriction. All the ways that human dignity is sacrificed for someone else's profit. The workers who freed themselves that December night did not defeat the system. They won a single battle in a war that continues. But they proved something essential about human nature, something that Samuel Thorne and others like him could never understand. They proved that the drive for freedom, for dignity, for the simple right to be treated as human rather than as property, is stronger than chains. That people will accept tremendous suffering, will endure horrible conditions, will submit to degradation, but only up to a point. That there is always a breaking point, always a moment when even the most downtrodden will say enough. For Thomas Brennan, that moment came when he swung the shuttle at Dutch's head. For Catherine O'Connor, it came when she thrust her hand into the loom. For Margaret O'Connor, it came when she agreed to help with the uprising, despite knowing the risks to herself and her daughter. For each of the workers who participated in the resistance, there was a moment of decision, a conscious choice to risk everything for the possibility of freedom. That is the message about freedom that the Coldwater Creek story teaches. Freedom is not a given. It is not guaranteed by documents or laws or noble sentiments. Freedom exists only to the extent that people are willing to fight for it, to sacrifice for it, to risk everything to achieve and maintain it. The chains will always exist in some form because there will always be people willing to impose them for their own benefit. The only question is whether there will be people willing to break them. The mill floor, where Catherine lost her fingers, now serves as someone's living room. The spot where Thomas Brennan broke his chains is now a home office with expensive furniture and abstract art on the walls. The building that housed so much suffering is now worth millions as real estate. History is literally papered over, renovated away, turned into something pleasant and profitable, But on cold December nights, when snow falls on Lawrence, when the wind howls off the Merrimack River, when the temperature drops and people hurry through the streets trying to get home, there are those who remember. Not through supernatural haunting, not through ghostly apparitions, but through the simple act of telling the story, of passing down the truth of what happened here, of refusing to let the chains be forgotten. That is, how the dead speak to the living in real horror stories, not through spectral voices or mysterious phenomena, but through the consequences of their struggles, through the legacy of their choices, through the lessons their suffering can teach, if we are willing to learn them. The terror of Coldwater Creek Mill is not that it happened. The terror is that it could happen again, is happening again in different forms, will continue to happen as long as some people have the power to exploit others and find it profitable to do so. The chains change shape but never disappear. The struggle for freedom is never finished. Thomas Brennan knew this. He spent his life trying to break chains, literal and metaphorical, and died knowing the work was incomplete. But he also died knowing that he had made a difference, that because of his actions and the actions of others like him, some people lived freer lives. Some chains were permanently broken, some small portion of human dignity was reclaimed from those who sought to destroy it. That is the only victory possible in a real horror story. Not the defeat of evil, which is impossible because evil is not an external force, but a human tendency, but rather the resistance to evil, the refusal to accept it as inevitable, the determination to break whatever chains can be broken, even knowing that new chains will be forged. The Coldwater Creek Mill stands as a monument to both the horror humans can inflict and the courage humans can display in response to that horror. It is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are human beings convinced that their profit matters more than other people's suffering. And it is a reminder that the most heroic acts are not grand gestures, but simple choices. The decision to say no, to resist, to help others break their chains, even at great personal cost. That is the message about freedom. It is not abstract or philosophical. It is concrete and immediate. Freedom is the absence of chains, and chains will always exist unless people are willing to break them. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, constant struggle, and the willingness to sacrifice for something larger than individual survival. The workers of Coldwater Creek Mill paid that price. They broke their chains. They won their freedom, imperfect and temporary as all freedom is. They showed that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary oppression, can find extraordinary courage. They proved that the human spirit, for all its failings and weaknesses, has a core of dignity that cannot be entirely crushed by exploitation. And they left behind a story, not of supernatural terror, but of the very real horror of human cruelty and the equally real heroism of human resistance. A story that deserves to be remembered not as historical curiosity, but as living warning and inspiration. The chains of Coldwater Creek Mill are melted down, but the choice they represent remains: submission or resistance, acceptance or struggle, chains or freedom. Each generation must make that choice anew. The chains take different forms, the overseers have different titles, the mechanisms of control evolve and adapt, but the fundamental question remains the same. Will you accept your chains or will you break them? Will you help others break theirs? What price are you willing to pay for freedom? These are not comfortable questions. They do not have easy answers. But they are the questions that matter, the questions that define what it means to be human in a world where some humans seek to control and exploit others. The story of Coldwater Creek Mill forces us to confront these questions, to see them not as abstractions, but as immediate and personal choices that real people had to make with real consequences. That is the psychological terror at the heart of this story. Not the fear of monsters or supernatural threats, But the fear of looking honestly at human nature and human society and recognizing how thin the line is between civilization and barbarism, how easily exploitation becomes normalized, how readily people will inflict suffering if it benefits them, and how difficult it is to resist such exploitation even when it threatens your life and dignity. But it is also a story of hope, of the possibility of resistance, of the power that ordinary people possess when they act together for their collective freedom. The workers of Coldwater Creek Mill were not heroes in the conventional sense. They were desperate, frightened, broken people pushed to their absolute limit, but they found the courage to act, to resist, to break their chains. And in doing so, they changed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless workers who came after them. That is the legacy of Coldwater Creek Mill, the real monument that endures beyond the physical statue in the park. It is the knowledge that chains can be broken, that exploitation can be resisted, that freedom is possible even in the darkest circumstances if people are willing to fight for it. Not easily, not without cost, not permanently, but possible nonetheless. The mill is silent now, converted to luxury homes, its violent history sanitized away. But the questions it raises remain as urgent as ever. What chains bind us today? Who profits from our submission? What price are we willing to pay for freedom? And most importantly, when will we break our chains?